We come now to our Bible study where we take a look at some of the scriptures that give us insight, spiritual insight into this theme we have today, and that is the miraculous power of self-sacrificial living. You know, the scriptures are probably 3,000 years old from the very earliest to the present time. And throughout these scriptures, there's one theme that just continues to be lifted up over and over and again, and that is the examples in the biblical history of the people who sacrificed themselves, or at least risked sacrificing themselves, and that is how humanity has made progress over the years. It's through the self-sacrificing life that we are now who we are today and have what we have today, and the world is as it is today because of the power of that self-sacrifice and the self-sacrificial living. So first of all, we start with the book of Esther from the Old Testament. It's one of those Old Testament books we don't listen to or read from very often, but it is a powerful book, and I would highly recommend that you take a look at it if you haven't read it before. It's a story. It's a story about this young Jewish woman who was named Esther. And the whole book, it's amazing. Matter of fact, they almost didn't put it in the Bible because there's no mention of God in the book at all. It's about her story and what she did and how it happened. And so today we're just going to read a little piece of it that kind of really gets the point of what she did. And so let me just read that section first, and then I'll elaborate a little bit upon it in case you don't remember her story too well. Then Esther sent this reply to her cousin Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jewish people in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my attendants, we will fast as you do. And when this is done, then I will go to the king. And even though it is against the law, and even though I may die, I will go. But if I perish, I perish. Now, what's that all about? Well, this is taking place in the Assyrian kingdom. This is after Israel has been totally destroyed by the big, huge Assyrian nation, and all the Jews were taken in exile into Babylonia. And Esther was one of those taken into captivity and into slavery. She was put in the king's harem, and once he met her and had relations with her, he fell in love with her, and he married her and made her his queen, even though he did not know she was Jewish. You see, the Jewish people were at that time completely treated very badly by the Byzantine Empire and the Assyrians. They were slaves, they were less than people, and their idea was, we don't associate with Jews, and in fact, we would rather there be no Jews. But she kept it secret that she was a Jew when she was made the queen, and the king had no idea about it. Of course, he had about 20 or 30 queens, so it wasn't a really big deal to be made queen. It just meant that you were a favorite of the king. But she was Jewish, and later, as time progressed, the people of the Byzantine Empire and the Assyrians were led by the second-in-command guy who was kind of in charge of the whole governmental operation, a guy named Haman. And Haman really wanted to get rid of all the Jews. He said, we've got to get rid of these people. They're just ruining our society. They're not worth it. We need to wipe them from the face of the earth. And so that was his idea, that we needed to do that. Haman had an idea that he would have a lottery every month, and the people that got the wrong numbers, or the short end of the stick, so to speak, they were the ones that would be killed. And when Esther found out about that an order had gone out that all of her people would be killed, especially she might herself even end up being killed if it were found out that she was Jewish, She decided she had to do something about it because she had some privilege in that she was a queen. She was one of the favorites of the king. Now, unfortunately, he hadn't called upon her in about 30 or 40 days, and that was a bad sign because it kind of meant that he had lost interest in her. And there was this big rule in Assyria at the time. The king made it very clear, and the whole government made it very clear, nobody comes to see the king unless they are invited by the king to come. You don't just show up and say, "Hey, king, how you doing today?" Because if you did that, you would be immediately executed on the spot and your head would be hung outside the castle to make sure everybody understood you don't visit the king without an appointment. But Esther decided, I got to go. I got to go there and talk to him and try to convince him not to let all my people be killed. And she realized that was going to be a very dangerous thing because she'd have to reveal the fact that she was Jewish and so on and so on. And that's how come she says in this passage that I'm going to go. I'm going to go to the king. I'm going to visit with him. No appointment. He didn't call me there. And I know I could have my head cut off immediately. But if I perish, I perish. You see? And so what we have here then is an example of one of the earliest forms of self-sacrifice that you find. And as some have pointed out, if Esther would not have done that and eventually was able to convince the king, which she was, if you read the rest of the book, convince the king that it was not right to kill all the Jewish people and basically that he should kill Haman instead, well, it turned out wonderful. But it was because of her self-sacrifice that happened. Had she not made that self-sacrifice, there would have been no more Jewish people, and there wouldn't even have been Jewish people when Jesus would supposedly be born in Bethlehem. So, because of her actions, it made the whole Jesus thing possible, you see. So, Esther was a very important example of the self-sacrificing life. And the key thought is, the self-sacrificing life puts the interest of others above oneself. And even if I perish, I perish. Okay, so we move on to Philippians now, which is another great, tremendous letter from the Apostle Paul. This one, of course, is in the time of the New Testament age. Now we have had Jesus come and been resurrected and gone on. And now we have Christian communities establishing all over the Mediterranean area, just popping up like crazy. And this is between probably about 50 A.D. Up to the present time, actually, but 50 A.D. up to about 120 A.D. was when all the growth took place in the Christian communities. And the reason the Christian communities sprang up and just started popping up all over the place, Paul, of course, was a great apostle going out, starting communities, and people were becoming very excited about the Christian faith. And the reason was the Christian faith was talking about a kind of lifestyle in which you sacrifice your own self-interest for the interest of others. That's what excited people. Never before in the Mediterranean area, never before in any of the European area, had anybody ever heard of a community that says, hey, we live for others, we don't live for ourselves anymore. And you knew in the Christian community, if you were able to get into the Christian community, they would feed you, they would clothe you, they would help you get a job, they would take care of you. It was a place to go and be saved in more ways than just spiritual, economical, every way. Educational opportunity, everything was provided. And that's why it was so popular. And these poor people especially would just surge to these Christian communities because they lived that way. And it worked amazingly like a miracle for about 50 to about 85, 90 A.D. But then people began to get greedy inside of the Christian communities. And the people that had a little bit more began to say, well, how come I need to give this to everybody else? Why can't I have what I have? Why can't I have my house? Why can't I have my property? Why do I have to share this with everyone? And so the whole Christian community began to cool down and things began to fade because they'd lost that original zeal of whatever I have, I give to whoever needs whatever they have. So Paul had to write a letter to Philippians because Philippians was one of the communities that had started off so beautifully, and they were known throughout the Mediterranean area for being a shining example of the self-sacrificial life. But they had lost their zeal. They were no longer really that dedicated to it. So I'm going to now read the section of this that he wrote to them, reminding them of the kind of life that they're supposed to be living. And he says, therefore, if you have experienced any encouragement from being with Christ, if you have found any comfort from his love, if you have in common any sharing of the Spirit, if you have found any tenderness, if you have found any compassion, then make my joy complete by once again being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and one of the same mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition. Do nothing out of vain conceit. Rather, remember, go and be humble, and in humility value others above yourself. Not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interests of others. So, Paul reminds them, and they woke up after this letter, and we see what we now call the second stage, or the second age of Philippi, which was the Philippian community. They rediscovered their great desire and joy in living the self-sacrificial life. So they went back to understanding the very basic part of Christian living. And so I lift them up as an example because as a whole community, not just one person, but as a whole community, they sacrificed whatever they had, not just their money, not just their property, but if one of them had more faith than another, they sacrificed their joy from their own faith to give that faith to somebody else. If someone had more peace than somebody else, they would sacrifice their enjoyment of that peace to give it to somebody else. It was a total giving community, one that gave everything they had to those who needed what it was they had. And so there it was. It was another great example. And then finally we come to the gospel lesson today, which is from the Gospel of John. And as is our custom, we stand as we read this gospel that we might remember it. This is a part of the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And we pick it up at this point. They're trying to decide how they're going to feed 5,000 people because they don't have that much food. And it says, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter, the brother of Simon Peter, spoke up and said, here's a little boy. He's got 5 loaves and 2 fish. But Lord, what are they among so many? But Jesus told the people to sit down. There were about 5,000 men there that day. And then he took those 5 loaves and he gave thanks and he began distributing them to the crowd as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. Amen. You may be seated now. As I said earlier, this is a great story. It's a big story. A lot of stuff goes on in there. This crowd is showing up out in the middle of the wilderness to listen to Jesus teach. Jesus has compassion on them, says, you know, it's getting dark, it's kind of late, we need to get, somehow they need to get something to eat. And the disciples say, well, the stores are all closed, we can't send them anywhere. How are we going to feed them? And then, of course, it zeroes in on this little boy who is standing there with a bag. And in the bag, he's got 5 loaves and 2 fish. And that food he's supposed to hold on to for his family. That's why they brought it. And the obvious becomes known to him that they're going to take that food away from him. We need those 5 loaves and we need those 2 fish. And so he gives it up. He gives it to the disciples and they take it to Jesus. And then, of course, the question is, what are you going to do with 5 loaves? I mean, how's that going to feed 5,000 people? How's that going to take place? And the whole point there is the self-sacrificial act of that little boy giving up the food he brought with him so that Jesus can feed the 5,000. And you have to think about it a little while, because people often wonder, you know, how did this miracle take place? How did all that food get multiplied? The fish get all multiplied? Well, you see, that crowd, everybody in that crowd had a little bag, just like the little boy had a little bag. And they were touched by his act of self-sacrifice. And they thought to themselves, you know, if that little boy can give up what he has in his bag, we can give up what we have in our bag. And among those 5,000 people who came out there in the middle of the wilderness, and Jews always brought something to eat with them, they always had a bag of food. There was plenty of food out there, it just was in everybody's individual bag. And they were inspired to open up their bags and start sharing among one another the things that they had that others could eat as well. And it was the inspiration of that little boy who sacrificed his own little bag of 5 loaves and 2 fish that enabled him to feed 5,000 people and have 12 basketfuls left over, you see. So it was the power of self-sacrifice. That's what made that miracle happen. And that power of self-sacrifice is what has made every miracle that has ever happened in the human race take place. And so today we're going to talk about that in our message. And that is this idea of looking for the miracle of becoming a person of self-sacrifice in your own life.